Bhaktivedanta Swami. Translation. O great sage, time annihilates everything in due course. So how is it that this subject matter, which happened prior to this day of Brahma, is still fresh in your memory, undisturbed by time? Translation with repetition. O great sage, time annihilates everything in due course. So how is it that this subject matter, which happened prior to this day of Brahma, is still fresh in your memory, undisturbed by time? Prabhupada by Srila Prabhupada. As spirit is not annihilated even after the annihilation of the material body, so also spiritual consciousness is not annihilated. Sri Narada developed this spiritual consciousness even when he had his material body in the previous kalpa. Consciousness of the material body means spiritual consciousness expressed through the medium of a material body. This consciousness is inferior, destructible, and perverted. But super consciousness of the supra-mind in the spiritual plane is as good as a spirit soul and is never annihilated. Thus ends the wonderful transcendental Bhaktivedanta purport. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyata Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, continuing the discussion between sage Vyasa and Narada, we are in the 6th chapter now. From the last chapter, we are seeing, in fact, from the end of the 4th chapter and beginning 5th chapter and now the 6th chapter, we are seeing this interesting conversation between Vyasadeva and sage Narada. So, yeah, in this verse, as we can see here, Munisattama, oh great sage. So here, Vyasadeva is speaking this verse, and he is addressing Narada Muni as Munisattama, oh great sage. Now, he's addressing here as Munisattama, and then he's also inquiring, he's asking one more question to Narada Muni. As we saw the importance of spiritual inquisitiveness in the last few classes, this is another further inquiry made by Vyasadeva in order to hear more about Sri Narada's journey, especially after he got initiated. What did he do? So as we saw in the last two previous verses, we saw what were the kind of questions that Vyasadeva is asking Narada Muni. So in continuation with that, so this is one more question. And what is the question here? So here, the question is Smritim Vyavadhat. So basically, in due course of time, as we see that our memory or remembrance fades away. So something that happened yesterday, we may remember slightly, but if something we ask even further behind what is yesterday, it starts to fade away. And even things that we did yesterday, or even today morning, perhaps which we did not pay enough attention, we may not be able to recollect. So usually our remembrance is not very strong. But here, as we can see Narada Muni explaining to Sri Vyasadeva about how he met Bhakti Vedantists and how he got initiated by them. So as we saw in the previous chapter, there was this clear instructions and the narration of Sri Narada as how he met the Bhakti Vedantists. But the question here is, now this incident happened in the previous life of Narada Muni, and that seems to happen in Prak Kalpa, in the previous Kalpa. So Kalpa is 1 day of Brahma, and that constitutes like 1,000 Mahayugas, all the 4 yugas combined. And now, after such huge period of time, still the subject matter is very clear in the mind of Narada Muni. Now, how is he able to remember all these things? And how is he able to explain all these things? So Vyasadeva is putting forward this question, is that, how is that? Kala esha sarva nirakritihi. So Kala, the time factor, destroys everything in due course of time, especially everything material. Now, that's what we usually see, but in this case, it is not the case. What is the factor which is leading Sri Naradji to explain the incidences which happened so long ago? So that is the question that is being asked here. O great sage, time annihilates everything in due course. So how is it that this subject matter, which happened prior to this day of Brahma, is still fresh in your memory, undisturbed by time? So how is this memory is still fresh? And there is no influence of time on this aspect of remembrance of Sri Naradji. So moving further, so let us look at the previous 2 verses. This is verse 6.4, 1.6.4, and this is verse 1.6.2, and there is 1.6.3. So in this, Vyasadeva is asking, what did you, Narada, do after the departure of the great sages who had instructed you in scientific transcendental knowledge before beginning of your present birth? So here, as we saw in the previous classes, Vyasadeva is very inquisitive to know what were the activities performed by his spiritual master, Sri Narada Muni, after he got initiated, after he was instructed by the Bhakti Vedantists, after they restored the mercy. And the next question, O son of Brahma, how did you pass your life after initiation, and how did you attain this body, having quit your old one in due course? So this is a continuation from the question of what did you do, how did you pass your life after initiation, and then what was the result of that practice? Now, we do not ask everyone, what did you do all the time? But we tend to ask people who are very successful. We want to ask them, how did you do? What did you do? And similarly here, the question is relevant because there is this result that has taken place. And what is that result? The result is that, how did you attain this body, having quit your old one in due course? Now, everyone is quitting a body and everyone is getting another body. So what is the big deal in asking, how did you quit your body or what did you do? But here, Narada Muni, in his previous life, he had a material body. But now, in this life, where this conversation between Sri Narada and Vyasadeva is happening, Narada Muni has a transcendental body. So this transformation is the reason why Vyasadeva is further interested to know, because unless there is nothing interesting, why would we ask anything? So here, this is such an important topic. Oh, how can one become from materially conditioned living entity to spiritually fully liberated? And Narada Muni's body, he can travel anywhere. And we also see how glorious Narada Muni is in this life, that he is always continuously glorifying the Lord. So from being a son of a maid servant, where he was not well educated, to someone who is glorified all over the world, all over the universe, everywhere. Now, how is that is happening? How is that he has achieved this so-called perfection? So how did he get transformed? And what were the activities that were done by Narada Muni? So that is the reason why this question is being asked. And further, the question in today's verse is also significant because a similar question was also asked by, I'm sorry, I think there's a similar question was also asked by Arjuna to Lord Krishna. Now, in the fourth chapter, as we see in the beginning of fourth chapter, Lord tells Arjuna that I have instructed this knowledge of yoga, the imperishable science of one's relationship with the Supreme Lord, first to Sun God, and then to Manu, and then to Ikshvaku. And in this way, this knowledge has been transmitted in the disciplic succession. And in due course of time, this knowledge was lost, and therefore I'm instructing you this knowledge today. Now, as soon as this Lord said these verses, these statements, Arjuna immediately asked that the sun god Vivaswan is senior by birth to you. Aparam bhavato janma, param janma vivasvataha. So I see you right now, O Lord Krishna, but the sun god appears to be very, very senior. So katham etad vijaniyam. So how is that I'm to understand that in the beginning you instructed the science to him? So similarly, the question is, how is Lord able to tell? Because we do not remember anything from our past life and neither from the past few days. So how is that one is able to, how is that the Lord is able to answer or remember what has happened long back, what he has done, and is able to explain? So as we see in the next two verses, in fact, 4.6, Lord explains his position, his transcendental position, and how, because he does not have a material body. So Prabhupada beautifully explains that Prakritim Swam Adhisthaya Sambhavami Atmamaya. So the Lord appears in his own transcendental form, his original transcendental form. So the Lord can remember everything because he does not change body like us. His original transcendental form is ever existing. And even when he comes to this material world, he is coming in the same original transcendental form. And therefore, there is no loss of memory or remembrance like what we undergo. And Prabhupada also further explains the position of the Lord in these verses 4.5 and 6 as the Lord is Advaitam, Achyutam, Anadim, Anantarupam, the wonderful qualities of the Lord, which are incomparable. And therefore, the Lord is able to remember everything, and he knows both past, present, and future. And therefore, he's able to explain what has happened long back. And now, one may also ask, why is Arjuna asking this kind of question? Arjuna accepts the Lord as the Supreme. Then why not believe directly the instructions of the Lord, and why put another question? So Prabhupada also explains that this is in order to elicit further description about the Lord from Lord's own mouth. So one of the reasons why Arjuna is asking is that so that he can hear more from the Lord about his own position. And second, this is also to help ordinary people understand the position of the Lord. Because ordinary conditioned souls do not accept the supremacy of the Supreme Lord. They may have questions and doubts. Oh, how is this possible? So in order to remove those doubts, for the sake of the general mass, Arjuna is putting forth these questions, not because he has any lack of faith, but rather just to elicit further explanation to the question that people might ask, so that it would become clear about the position of the Lord. So you can see that the questions asked by great devotees are always very, very relevant, and they are very special. There is a reasoning behind the questions, there is significance behind each of the questions that are asked. Similarly, the questions that are being asked by Vyasadeva are also very significant. Now, what is the significance? As we saw in a couple of verses back also, that Sadharma Pricha. So this kind of inquiry to understand the Sadharma, the eternal truth, is very, very important. And we can see that this process of Bhakti Yoga, or as presented by Srila Prabhupada and the Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, is not a sentimental or a whimsical way of following something. Inquisitiveness is very much appreciated and encouraged, as we can also see that all the sages are inquisitive. Vyasadeva is inquisitive to know more. But the question is, what are we inquisitive to know? So as we see in all these questions, the questions that are being asked are eliciting further spiritual meaning, the further description about the activities of the devotees, and the further the activities of the Lord, the position of the Lord, and so on and so forth. So the nature of the questions is very significant in all these places. Further, it is also important to know that these questions are asked by the great devotees so that it brings satisfaction to everyone. As we saw even in the last class, that Suta Goswami, as soon as he starts to begin, he starts to express his gratitude to all the sages for the questions they asked, because these questions, which are connected with the Supreme Lord, they give satisfaction to the soul. And therefore, these questions, which are also being asked by Vyasadeva when heard by devotees, they bring satisfaction to the soul, because these are connected with the great devotees of the Lord. And further, these questions are also asked, as we see in the previous verse, that by understanding these activities of the great devotees, we can follow in their footsteps. And by following in their footsteps, we can also achieve the result that they have achieved. Now, as we saw, Narada Muni has now got a transcendental body. He's completely liberated. He's completely a perfect devotee. How did this happen? So these activities, when these questions are asked, they are meant to help us also to understand how we can reach to the perfect stage of spiritual life. So beginning with that, let us look in the very beginning in the translation. Prabhupada is explaining this word, Kala Esha Sarva Nishkritihi, Nirakritihi, sorry, Nirakritihi. So the word Nirakritihi means annihilation. So Prabhupada is saying that time annihilates everything in due course. So before we understand a little more about the influence of time and what time does, let us try to understand what is time a little more. So Prabhupada says that time is nothing but a representation of the Lord. And it is very interesting to note that how Bhagavatam and the Vedic scriptures, they talk about all the fundamental aspects of existence and what lies even beyond the material existence so clearly. Because time is such an elusive factor, it is so difficult to understand. Now I can see a table, I can touch a table, maybe I can feel air, but how is this time? What is this time? It's so difficult to understand. It is so difficult to hold, to measure. So how do we understand this unique aspects of which is so difficult to perceive? But it is so interesting that the scriptures and Prabhupada's explanation also helps us to make bring us a clarity about what these things mean and why they exist, what it is, and so on and so forth. So Prabhupada says in different places that time is nothing but the representation of the Supreme Lord. So as we see even in 11th chapter, when Arjuna sees the universal form of the Lord, he becomes bewildered, he becomes frightened. And then he asks, who are you? And then in those verses, I think it's 32nd or 33rd verse, the Lord says, Kalo asmi loka kshaya krit. The blessed Lord said, time I am, destroyer of the world. So we also see that this verse is also quoted by some scientists and also popular. So that the Lord here is describing time I am. So this unique aspect of life which is surrounding us all the time, no living entity in the material world is free from the influence of time. And that time is nothing but the Supreme Lord. In fact, a representation of the Supreme Lord. Now, Prabhupada says that sometimes people may say that I'm not under the influence of the Supreme Lord, I'm independent. But Prabhupada says, at least someone who is not Vimuda, who is not very, very foolish, he can perceive that he is under the influence of time. No sane man can say that he is not under the influence of the time. Everyone is under the influence of time. And therefore, one is under the influence of the Supreme Lord all the time. There is no question of one not being under the influence of the time and not under the influence of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, this idea of independence is completely wrong. And Prabhupada further elaborates as how time influences all these 24 elements. So the living entity and the other Prakriti, the other elements which are made, they're all moving under the influence of time. Therefore, there is nothing which is not under the influence of time in the material world. And therefore, everything in this world is under the influence of the Supreme Lord. Now, this influence of the time, because everything under the influence of the time, it is important to understand the influence of time. As we also saw in few verses before, in 5th chapter, 1st canto, if you get the verse, but there also it was mentioned as how things, the potency, the power of material things especially gets diminished in Kali Yuga. And Prabhupada gives there examples of how the land will not produce enough, how there will be shortage of so many things, and how all the power of the material objects start to diminish in the age of Kali Yuga. So there is a special factor of time in Kali Yuga in the sense our lifespan is decreasing, our memories are short, and we are not as strong as our previous generation people are. So the influence of time is especially even more stronger in Kali Yuga. Destruction is even more faster. And the influence of material energy is so high that the spiritual values, people find it very difficult to appreciate. So we can see how this influence of time is leading to destruction of things. And Prabhupada gives two simple examples. One is that of our own body. So Prabhupada says, any sane man can see that he was a child once upon a time, now he has grown up to maybe young or adult or an old man. And in this all spheres of time, in all these cases, the time has slowly destroying the power of the individual. And therefore, it is very important to be aware of what is happening in this influence of time. And Prabhupada says, even if you have a new table, you put it in one place and don't do anything, but in due course of time, that table will be destroyed. That is the force of influence of time on any object in the material world. And here, another example in another place, it is also mentioned that the time is considered like a wave. So everything that comes under it is crushed. So similarly, this entire universe, material universe, is under the influence of the time. And therefore, it's a matter of time before which everything that is material, which is in manifestation, is going to destroy. So this is one of the important aspects of influence of time, that everything that is material is vanquished. Second, the influence of time is unavoidable. It is everyone in the material existence, uh, every conditioned living entity cannot escape this influence of time. There is no way. Prabhupada says, you may be very, very powerful. You may be scientifically strong. You may be having some sort of technology, but this influence of time, no one can avoid. Mrityu sarvasya chaham. In due course of time, death will come. The influence of time is pushing one closer to the death. And there is no way to avoid this influence of time, which brings this fourfold miseries. Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadhi. And everyone is undergoing, is under the influence of this time. Now, foolish people think that, oh, I can do whatever I want and I can escape the influence of time, escape the influence of destruction of time, or escape the influence of time by doing something else. No one can escape. And even the most powerful, even the strongest of strong cannot escape this influence of time. And here we can also see it even conquers the most powerful. Kalena va te balinam baliyasa. So Prabhupada explains that so-called emperors, so-called kings, so-called great scientists, Einstein, or any other person, politician, leader, rich man, everyone may think, oh, I'm very powerful in this period of time. Or a young boy may think, oh, I'm very strong, I'm being taken care, I have no problem. But in due course of time, the time is so strong that it conquers even the so-called most powerful men in the material world. So there is no one, even from the Brahma Loka, highest planet in the material world, to the lowest planet, everyone is influenced. No one can conquer this force of time. Now, this is such a powerful force of time, and it's so important for everyone to recognize this and see how can one overcome some of the influences of time. And it is also said that the influence is present in the entire material world. Kalena sarvatra ghabira ramhasa. So, sarvatra, the influence of time is in every part of this material universe. So this factor of past, present, and future, this aspect of time is present in all the material world. There is no way one can be freed from this influence. In any space, someone may think, oh, I'll go to Mars. Maybe I'll go to some other place and maybe I can escape some influence of time. But no, Shastra says in all spaces in the material world, there is this influence of time. And further, we also see in the instructions of Vidura that how time is, the influence of time is irreversible. There is no way to change the influence of the time backwards. No, not possible. And it is imperceptible. It is, one cannot see by gross senses. It is so fine that it is imperceptibly acting on each one of us. So these are some of the aspects of the influence of time. Now, Srila Prabhupada also explains about how one should handle these influences of time from the Shastras. But before we go there, there is one more aspect of influence of time. That aspect is called fear. Kalam eke yato bhayam. So in this third canto, where Kapila Muni is talking, the another aspect of time is that it brings fear. As we see here, appearingly nice image showing how everyone is under the grip of time. And as one is under the grip of time, one becomes fearful, especially when one is in the material consciousness. As soon as there is this idea of I'm this body, different from my spirit soul, As soon as one identifies with this, one is seeing that in the influence of time, things are going away. Things are getting destroyed. My body is getting destroyed. The things that I thought that are mine are getting destroyed. So immediately that fear engulfs one. And fear of, oh, what will happen to my family because they're connected to my body? What will happen to something else because I think that it belongs to me, that belongs to my nation, my community. And because of this false identification, in course of time, the influence of time leads to fear. So in this way, there are many other aspects of influences of time which are very interesting to note. And even how one can overcome this influences of fear, which comes in due course of time. If one is not prepared to understand the influence of time and deal with it, all these aspects of destruction, fear is going to come to individuals. And therefore, Bhagavatam also instructs us what needs to be done. So Srila Prabhupada in various lectures explains about what needs to be done. And one last example before we go further on the influence of time. Now here we can see Bhishma Deva surrounded with the Pandavas and Lord himself, who's in the deathbed, bed of arrows. And here he is giving, first, as soon as he sees Yudhishthira Maharaj, the Pandavas, he becomes very sorrowful, he becomes very sad. And he thinks how these righteous sons of Pandu, they had to undergo so much tribulation. There is Bhima, Arjuna, the great warriors. And there is a righteous king, Yudhishthira. And on top of that, there is a Supreme Lord himself who is present on their side. But still, they had to undergo so many difficulties. Why was that? Why did that happen? And he says that it is only because of the time factor. There is no way to explain this. Everything is good. So why the reverses? Only because of the time factor. And what is the time factor? Time factor is the wish of the Lord, will of the Lord. And because Lord wanted it, it happened, not because of any other reason. And therefore, it is also mentioned that when something is beyond one's control, one should not lament unnecessarily. Because it's a factor of time. In that factor of time, sometimes we cannot do anything. Because it is the wish of the Lord. But it is important that in spite of the so-called reverses in the course of time, the spiritual consciousness of the devotees is never changed. In fact, it becomes stronger and stronger, as we see in Kunti Maharani's prayers. The reverses only increases devotees' devotion to the Lord, even though it may come in due course of time. They do not materially try to sometimes push back those, but accept them as a mercy of the Lord and try to increase their devotion. And so this is one wonderful example of how Pandavas dealt with this influence of time, which brought them many reverses, many difficulties. And there's a beautiful verse, 1.9.15, where this discussion is happening about the factor of time, and Bhishma Deva is talking there. So it's a very nice example of how even devotees can undergo suffering because of time, but they are never deviated from their fundamental task of performing devotional service. So moving on, so how do we deal with this influence of time? So because it is influencing each one of us, and as we see, the factor of destruction and fear is a constant accompaniment to the influence of time. So Prabhupada says, in order to overcome the influence of time, first one must save time. And what Prabhupada means by this is that we should not engage in unwanted sense gratificatory or material pursuits. We all artificially create so many necessities And in pursuing those necessities, we have to do multiple things. As we know the story of the, a person who was instructed by a sage to read Bhagavad Gita. And when he saw that in the clothes, there were some rats which were moving, and he thought maybe I should get a cat. In order to feed the cat, he goes to bring a cow, and so on and so forth. So in this way, we also try to complicate our lives in multiple ways. We entangle ourselves in different occupations for no reason. And at the end, we see that we do not have time. But the first question is, why am I not having time? What is that I'm doing which is taking away my time? Is it worth to do those things? One should question, because Srila Prabhupada especially emphasized simple living and high thinking to reduce the clutter of life. Because if there is a lot of clutter, there is no way one can practice spiritual life. And therefore, if one wants to overcome these negative influences of time, then one must first remove the clutter of unwanted things in life, save time. So, and that's why Srila Prabhupada has created various farm communities. Prabhupada said, come out of this busy city life, lead simple life, grow your own food, spend the rest of your time chanting, doing devotional service. And Prabhupada also created a system so as to reduce this clutter of unwanted necessities of life. We create so many unwanted necessities of life, and in order to fulfill them, we end up in different loops. So the question we need to ask, is this necessary? Is it artha or anartha? So as we cannot, in the beginning stages of life, we cannot understand what is artha and anartha. And therefore, Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, by hearing their instruction, we can understand what is artha and what is anartha, what is required and what is not required. Only when we can understand what is required and what is not required, we can discard what is unrequired and save our time. So this is first instruction Srila Prabhupada gives in one of his lectures, that one should save one's time. Second, Srila Prabhupada says, as you save time, now you have time with you. If you can save time, then you need to do something positive. And Prabhupada says that one should follow this principle of Kirtanya Sadahari. One must glorify the Lord by chanting, by some form or the other form of devotional service. One must be engaged positively in devotional service. How can I become more Krishna conscious? That should be the goal. And if one is able to do this, as we also see in Bhagavatam, that the lifespan of everyone is decreasing except those who are hearing the glories of the Lord or who are chanting the glories of the Lord. So this influence, as we also see, Chanakya Pandit says that even a moment of time that is lost cannot be regained even by spending crores of gold coins. So this time is so valuable, and therefore it is emphasized that we utilize them in the right way in developing our Krishna consciousness. So when we develop this positive acts of devotional service, then we are freed from the clutches of the influence of time as it acts on conditioned souls. Then Prabhupada says, but for many in the beginning, it is very difficult to continuously chant, to continuously perform the hearing Bhagavatam or chanting continuously. Then what should they do? So Prabhupada says, Karmana Manasa Vacha Shreya Acharanam Sada. So Prabhupada says in the neophyte stage, one must engage oneself continuously. Engagement is required in Krishna service. And Prabhupada says, engagement how? By working, karmana. One must work for Krishna. Manasa, or by thinking. One must think, what can I do for Krishna? How can I serve? Is there a way I can contribute somewhere by my ability to think or my intelligence? Or vacha, or can I speak something about the glories of the Lord? Can I engage in some service? Can I go and call some more people, come and attend this wonderful Krishna Katha? So this, when one is doing this by this engagement, Prabhupada says that one can also handle this negative influence of time, and more importantly, one will develop the ability to further progress in one's ability to do mature devotional service, to increase one's devotion, or spend more time performing devotional service. Prabhupada also says that reading his books is another way we can overcome this influence of time, because in course of time, our guna pravaha, the modes of material nature which are acting, the past karma that we are carrying, this starts to fructify in different ways. Unless we are not in touch with the spiritual substance, either in the form of reading Srila Prabhupada's books or chanting or engaging in some way, we will be engaged in another activity which is going to bind us, which is going to entangle us somewhere else. So if we want to really free from this entangling influence of time, especially for a conditioned soul, we need to engage in different aspects of devotional service. In this way, that we can get freed from this influence of time, which is can cause havoc in our life, and especially fear. So these are some ways in which one can handle the influence of time. Now, let us come back to the question that is being asked in this question, in this verse. How is Narada able to remember the past incidents that happened in the life of in the previous kalpa, in the previous life of Narada, and how is he able to explain that? So Prabhupada wonderfully explains in the purport what is the reason behind this, that Narada Muni is able to explain this. So Prabhupada first says that spirit is never annihilated. So as spirit is never annihilated, so this body, na hanyate hanyamane sharire, so this sharira is destroyed, but the spirit is never destroyed. And therefore, Prabhupada says that similarly, so just like spirit is never destroyed, all the body is destroyed, the spiritual consciousness is never annihilated. So, so Prabhupada is bringing in the eternal aspects. So there is the spirit which is eternal, and so is also spiritual consciousness which is also eternal, and therefore is never annihilated. Now, Prabhupada says that Sri Narada Muni developed the spiritual consciousness in his previous life. So the first point is spirit is never annihilated, and then the spiritual consciousness also is not annihilated similarly. And Narada Muni has developed the spiritual consciousness in his previous life. So Prabhupada further explains what the spiritual consciousness is, but it is important to note here that when one has developed one's spiritual consciousness, it also remains. And especially, as we will also see in the 6th chapter that we are discussing, Prabhupada explains, even in Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere also, that by practicing Bhakti Yoga, we are coming in association of the transcendental eternal Lord. And therefore, those acts of devotion or Bhakti Yoga that we perform is also not lost. In other words, the spiritual consciousness that we gain through the process of Bhakti Yoga is not lost, and therefore it is carried on. But in this case of Narada Muni, he has fully developed his spiritual consciousness. He has fully perfected, and therefore he is able to carry that perfection from there on. So in his previous life, by the mercy of Bhaktivedantis and by his practices, as we will see in the coming verses, as what he has done after getting initiated, by doing that, he has got this perfection of spiritual consciousness. And because of that, he is able to remember and carry on that, and is able to explain here. Further, Prabhupada also explains that the consciousness of the material body means spiritual consciousness expressed through the medium of a material body. So what Prabhupada is saying here is that one may say that So first we can note that consciousness is always spiritual in the sense consciousness never comes from matter. Matter is not conscious. The spirit is the one which is conscious. But when the spirit is in the body, the consciousness of the material body means spiritual consciousness expressed to the medium of a material body. So in its original state, the spirit expresses its own consciousness without being under the influence of matter. But when the living entity is in the body, it is expressing this consciousness, spiritual consciousness under the influence of the material body. Now, this consciousness of the living entity, which is exhibited under the influence of the material body, has got certain characteristics. What is that? That consciousness or this consciousness is inferior, destructible, and perverted. So as we see, a child may carry a certain consciousness, and so as he grows, he may carry a different consciousness of that particular body. Now, that consciousness, which is under the influence of that body or expressed through the medium of that body, is inferior because it does not last forever. A child who is conscious of some things in the childhood may forget and may have a different consciousness. So this does not remain, and therefore it is destructible. It gets lost in course of time. That kind of consciousness, and it is not the pure consciousness, because this is a consciousness that is coming from the temporary aspects of existence, the body, and the world around, which is also temporary. Now, on the other hand, the other kind of consciousness that Narada Muni is carrying here, Prabhupada says, super consciousness of the supra mind. Elsewhere, it is described that the awakening of the spiritual consciousness or the spiritual mind on the spiritual plane is the reason why which cannot be annihilated. So whereas this consciousness which is arising from the material mind or the influence of the matter, that can be destroyed. But the other kind of consciousness, which is coming from the spiritual mind, from the spiritual consciousness, that is as good as spirit soul and is never annihilated. So there is a difference in spiritual awakening. There is a difference on the spiritual plane. When there is a different evolution in consciousness, that consciousness gets carried to next lives and so on and so forth until one reaches perfection. So it is this spiritual awakening that takes place in the life of Narada, enables him to carry this remembrance of his perfection and the activities that have taken place in the past kalpa. And as we will see in the next verses, Narada Muni will start explaining more about his activities, what he has done after he got initiated. I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments. So I was hearing another devotee explain this. So there is a spiritual, just like we have material body, material senses, and so on and so forth. There is spiritual mind and spiritual senses. So there is an awakening of the spiritual mind, and that leads to. So in fact, Maharaj was explaining that. So when there is an awakening of spiritual consciousness in the spiritual mind, and the spiritual awakening of the spiritual mind and elevation, the spiritual plane, that consciousness remains. But on the other hand, the consciousness of the material body under the influence of the body and expressed through the medium of the body, that does not last. There is a difference in the kind of consciousness that is coming out of the body, and there is a consciousness that is coming because of the elevation in the spiritual mind or the spiritual consciousness. And that consciousness, when it is elevated, that can remain, but the other one does not remain.
Arjuna, he was also a pure devotee. Understanding? Yes, so, I would have thought he would also have such awakened consciousness, spiritual consciousness. But then he did not remember the previous births. And the purport also Prabhupada said the difference between Krishna and the living entities. So is that by Krishna's will that he was made to forget his previous births, or what? How do we understand this?
So I think as Prabhupada says in another place, the role of Arjuna is to always act as a friend of the Lord, trying to elicit this message of Bhagavad Gita. So maybe it's for this reason that he is not fully aware. So it could be that reason. But so constitutionally, all the pure devotees are fully conscious of their constitutional position and the position of the Lord. But for the enactment of that specific act, the devotees may appear not to be carrying the pure consciousness. Or yes.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Mataji.
So in this pastime of Gajendra, Indradyumna, and the crocodile, Gajendra remembers after thousands of years of struggle with the crocodile, he remembers the prayers that he from his previous birth, and he offers them. So that he remembers all of that because he reached that supra consciousness.
So Prabhupada in another place explains that the living entity cannot remember everything like the Lord. Lord can remember everything in the past, present, and future, but the living entity can attain that super consciousness when the living entity is completely dovetailed with the Supreme Lord. When his consciousness is completely dovetailed with the Supreme Lord, then he can access that super consciousness, Prabhupada says. Now, also Prabhupada says that the Lord as Paramatma is giving remembrance. So at a specific point of time, it's by the will of the Lord that the remembrance of those prayers come because of the past acts performed by the living entity. The Lord may give a memory. Okay, now you have desired and so on and so forth. And therefore, now the memory comes, remembrance comes, and they start doing certain acts. So I'm not exactly sure as what is the exact reason, but Prabhupada says these 2 points about when the living entity is purely dovetailed with the supreme consciousness, then one is in super consciousness because he's accessing that through the mercy of the Lord. And the second is that the Lord as Paramatma is giving remembrance to the devotees based upon Ye yatha mam prapadyate tam siddha bhajamiham. So based upon their surrenderance and things, the Lord is also giving them respective remembrances.
Thank you, Prabhu.
If there are no questions or comments, we'll stop here. Thank you all. Granthiraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Premanande.
Hari Hari Bol.
Thank you for joining. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.